A Star and a Stranger. Part 2, Chapters 5 to 7. Chapter 5, Unspoken Words. The next day, Minji struggled to push the memory of their brief interaction to the back of her mind. She had no reason to fixate on it, and besides, Xavian, whoever the hell he was a stranger. He'd come into her world for a moment, though, and gone back into the darkness, as strangers do. But as she performed the motions of rehearsals and meetings, an irritating feeling stirred in her stomach. It was not discomfort, but some odd tug. She couldn't help but wonder if he was still holed up somewhere, if he had experienced that brief connection she had when their eyes met. But Minji was not having any of that. She had no room for distractions in her life. Not now. Not when the return was imminent, when every facet of her life was so meticulously mapped out for public viewing. Xavian, though, couldn't stop thinking about her. Every night he walked those same streets, searching for the home rhythm of the city in an effort to quiet his feral, racing thoughts. But he had stopped looking for the city. It was her now. And he couldn't quite get it. Why the meeting with Minji had impacted him. One brief moment, but the way she looked at him, the way she walked with such quiet elegance, made him think there was more beneath the surface than what the world saw. He tried to dismiss it. Just another moment, just another face. But the truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about her. That night, Xavian sat on his apartment's rooftop once more, the city hum beneath him, and his phone buzzed in his pocket. It came from a number he didn't recognize. "You're being too careless." Xavian's hand went white-knuckled on the phone. He expected this message. The past did not let go easily. "Stop looking for trouble." His fingers percolated across the screen, but he remained silent. There was nothing to say, but it was a reminder that even the simplest of choices, like talking to a stranger, if only for a moment, could be consequential. But for Minji, the next few days went by in a blur. The cyclone of promotion, rehearsals, and relentless attention was a good distraction. However, all this while, there were times that she would say that she was lost in thoughts by thinking about the man whom she met that night. There was no reason to continue thinking of him, no reason to believe their fleeting moment meant anything beyond the passing of time. But she couldn't help thinking that their paths had to cross again at some point for some reason. The voice of her manager broke through her thoughts. "Minji, you've been distracted these days. Is everything okay?" Minji forced a smile. "Just tired." Her manager's gaze sharpened. "You are the face of New Jeans. One misstep, and all that we have built could go up in flames. You need to be careful." Each of those drop everything words rained down harder on Minji's chest than the last, but she nodded, her smile shuddering. "I know." And that feeling, as familiar as it might be, shook her. One night, after a long series of photo shoots, Minji felt like taking another walk. It was now a kind of habit, a way for her to grab a few minutes of peace before she returned to the never-ending whirlpool that was her idle life. She walked around the park on a cool night. The city lights around her dimmed, and the sounds of the streets receded. She pulled her jacket around her shoulders and into her bones. And as she walked past the little café she had approached the week before, she hoped for it. That same silent tension she had felt that night. She slowed her steps and looked back toward the entrance, half expecting to see the same dark figure standing there. But he wasn't. And yet she felt it, the pull, as if the city had conspired to put them back together again, even if only for a moment. Standing in the dark margins of the café, invisible to the browsing energizers, Xavian predicted Minji would pass by for a second time. Tonight she felt different. Less open, and her eyes far away, as if she were thinking thoughts he could not follow. But the moment she came into his sight line, his heart stuttered. He knew he shouldn't be here. He knew he needed to go before she noticed him, before she had a chance to ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. But he didn't move. He couldn't. Minji turned her eyes to the cafe, and for a moment their eyes met again. Her eyes stopped for a heartbeat, and then turned, and she kept on in that same direction without so much as a stutter. Xavian gasped in his own breath. Why hadn't she stopped? But he said he wasn't sure what would have happened if she did. Minji kept walking. The road ahead seemed as lonely as the one she had walked down several days before. But something had shifted. She understood it in her bones. A sense of loose ends, like the world had nudged her toward a meeting that should not have been forgotten. No way, she told herself. But still, she couldn't remove the fact that the ghost of Xavian lingered in her thoughts long after her body had returned to the real world. Minji walked the streets with the same soft stride she had for the previous week, but something felt off this particular night. It wasn't anything she could identify, just some slight differential in the air, as if the city itself had noticed her. It was like it waited for her to turn the corner and return to the place she had walked by that night. She looked up at the café where she had last spotted him, the stranger in the dark hoodie. He wasn't there, of course. Why would he be? For him, she was, if even for a moment, an ephemeral part of the night, someone he had brushed against and could then retreat back into the darkness. But even while she was saying to herself that it didn't matter, her feet had slowed, bringing her to the lips of the street corner, where the lights of the café flowed out into the night. For a brief period she stood there, watching the glass doors open and close, pondering whether she would see him again. Xavian sat at his favorite table, in the corner of the café, but not really noticing the dark coffee he was stirring. He'd been coming here every night, and for some reason, he continued to expect that he would see her again. Minji. He wasn't the type of guy to fixate on a stranger he hardly spoke to. But there was something about her that bothered him, a silent something. Something in her eyes that created the sensation he had to find out more. It came close to instinct when he got up and shoved his chair back. He didn't want to, but his feet led him to the door, as his mind wondered why he even gave a fuck. He stepped into the cool night air which skimmed across his face, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he caught sight of her outline, and then she turned the corner and was gone. He hesitated, but she was gone. Minji continued on, and tried not to dwell on the way her heart had given itself a little jump while she passed the café. She had only waited a few moments, but the void in her chest felt heavier than normal. She knew she was fantasizing, making a connection out of something so minor and fleeting. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that somehow her steps had brought her here again. For the next several days, their encounters were short. A look, a nod, a moment they crossed paths just enough to ignite the curiosity brewing in the both of them. When she passed, Xavian would be in the café, his eye remaining on her for a moment after she disappeared into the night. Minji would see him and immediately look away, as though trying to deny that he was watching her. But while they remained mute, there was an irresistible pull. The sort of pull that spoke of unsaid threads and of brief encounters. One night, Minji was standing at that same street corner again. The café was in front of her, and she didn't need to look to know Xavian could be inside. But tonight she didn't want to see. Not yet. Instead, she walked past it slowly, her eyes straight ahead. She could feel her heart beating fast again, and she didn't know why. Perhaps it was because he had been in her mind for days on end, and this had never been her intention. Or perhaps it was the odd feeling of being watched that had always nagged her in the back of her mind. But when she got to the far end of the block and risked a glance over her shoulder, he wasn't there. The café was quiet, and still, the tightness that had lodged itself in her chest wouldn't go away. Xavian was missing that night, but when Minji turned the corner, she could almost swear she'd felt his presence. Just a moment's glimpse of unseeing eyes, the silent gap between their bodies crackling with something unspoken. That night, Minji walked home with her thoughts entangled in Xavian's voice, his eyes, the way he had looked at her like she was the only person in the world. But behind his warm gaze, she couldn't help but feel there was something he was not sharing with her, something hidden behind the calm facade he carried like a mask. Neither knew why they could not let go of thinking of the other, but both were about to discover that this pull, this odd magnetic attraction between them, was anything but random. Chapter 6: The Space Between Us. The days had started to blur for Minji, a steady cycle of practice, rehearsals, and promotional schedules. But in the midst of all that mania, there was always a still moment, an empty space filled with thoughts of just one encounter. Xavian. It wasn't that she had him on her mind. It was that every time she discovered herself wandering the streets at night, it was as if an unseen force or desire led her feet toward the café. The way he'd looked at her, the silence between them that had somehow felt both comforting and terrifying at the same time. She had no reason to continue thinking about him. And yet, each time she passed, she couldn't help wondering if he was there, watching her walk by. For Xavian, the days continued in such a pattern. He'd go to the café, settle into his usual corner, and watch the world go by. But for the past few days, his eyes had been waiting for a sight of her. Minji. He knew it wasn't a healthy thing. For years, he avoided attachments, keeping far away from anything that threatened his carefully constructed solitude. But there was something in her, something in how she moved, the quiet force in every stride she took, that had made him restless. He attempted to assure himself that he was merely going through a fleeting moment of interest, that this feeling would pass. But it never did. One night, after a long, hot, and tiring session at the practice studio, Minji went outside again. It had become a ritual she had come to rely on, those nighttime strolls that gave her an opportunity to clear her mind. But tonight, the pull had never seemed so strong. She didn't know why, but she found herself on her way back to the cafe again. She convinced herself it was a coincidence, that she wasn't looking for him. But somehow, her feet took her there anyway. As she approached the corner, she didn't halt. That's when she took off, walking faster and faster, as though she could escape her own mind. She didn't know what it was that she was afraid of. Xavian was sitting in the cafe again, at his usual spot near the window, the familiar warmth of the cafe surrounding him. He'd only just taken a sip of his coffee when he saw her, Minji, walking down the street. For just a heartbeat, he was frozen. She hadn't seen him. Xavian glanced over as she passed by, eyes straight ahead. She did not stop, did not even glance his way. He felt, if only for a moment, relief. Perhaps this was the universe advising him to quit, to let her go, to not obsess over a brief moment in time. But then, as though the universe wanted him to be his own version of Batman, Minji stopped at the corner of the street. She had yet to leave, lingering there just a few feet away. Her shoulders tense, her posture angular, as if struggling against something in herself. Minji stood cringing at the street corner, trying to catch her breath. She had ceased to walk on instinct, that odd sense of expectation she could not put into words hanging in the atmosphere. She'd been walking so fast before, but standing there she couldn't help the sense that something or someone was just around the corner. She paused a moment, then looked back over her shoulder, her gaze settling on the cafe on the opposite side of the street. It was empty, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, she felt the familiar rush of disappointment that coursed through her. Why did she feel this way? What was she looking for that she couldn't even name? But as she turned away to continue, she felt it again, a presence. Something calling her back towards the cafe. For a second, she didn't know if she was hallucinating. But when she gazed up again, a silhouette crossing behind the cafe window caught her eye. It wasn't much, just a fleeting glimpse of a figure. It was a familiar presence she couldn't ignore. And then it was just gone like that. Xavian was watching her from the corner of the cafe, his heart beating fast. She had looked back. For an instant, he thought she might come inside. He had expected her to. But she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked away, down the street, the distance between them widening with each step. Minji stood at the edge of the bridge, the city lights shimmering below like a sea of stars. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but it did little to calm the storm in her chest. She hadn't planned to come here tonight, but something, an instinct, a pull, had led her back to this spot. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed softly. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You're here again," Xavian's voice was low, almost hesitant. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." Minji turned to face him, her heart pounding. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, "but I couldn't stay away." Xavian stepped closer, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "You know this is dangerous, right? For both of us." "I know," Minji said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "But I'm tired of pretending. Tired of being Minji of new jeans all the time. With you, I feel like I can just be me." Xavian's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of something else. Fear, maybe, or regret. "Minji, I'm not who you think I am. There are things about me. Things you don't know." "Then tell me," she said, stepping closer. "Let me in. I'm not afraid." For a moment, Xavian looked like he might pull away. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I want to," he said quietly, "but I don't know if I can." The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unanswered questions. But for the first time, Minji felt like they were standing on the edge of something real, something worth fighting for. That night, Minji walked home with a strange ache in her chest, the quiet burden of something unsaid lying heavily between her and the city. She had not seen him clearly, but he felt her, felt the pull of his presence, as if he had been watching her all of this time. Her mind kept buzzing, and she couldn't sleep. She didn't even know what she was searching for, but sadly, she knew the more she tried to run from it, the more it would devour her. That night, as she walked home, Minji felt unsettled. The glow of the streetlights above her blinked, casting elongated shadows that pooled on the pavement. Her feet were moving of their own accord, but her mind was miles away, fantasizing about the cafe, about him. The way her heart raced did not even register in her head, each step repeating the encounter in her mind. The blurred figure in the window, the shadow she'd seen, it stayed with her long after she'd rounded the corner. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jerking her to the present. The message from her bandmate broke her from the shroud of longing. "Where are you? We're at the dorm waiting for you." Minji sighed and quickly typed a reply. She had to put these thoughts aside. There were other things to worry about, other facets of her life that counted. Her focus couldn't wander now. Not when so much was demanded of her career. Xavian sat in his apartment that night, the quiet enfolding him like a thick blanket. His phone was sitting on the coffee table untouched. He hadn't even tried to call anybody. There wasn't anyone to talk to anyway. Instead, he was pacing. He was still processing those moments he shared with Minji. She had glanced back at the café, hadn't she? That instant of realization. But it was fleeting. She hadn't stayed. And no matter how he tried to convince himself he didn't care, that he was better off alone, there was something about her, something about the way she haunted his thoughts, that wouldn't let him be. Frustration roiled just below the surface, and he ran a hand through his hair. What was it about her? Why was he unable to shrug off the sense that their paths were destined to cross again? For both of them, the days passed in a blur. Their lives never entirely overlapped, but those hushed moments, the instances in which they almost crossed paths, continued to lure them together. They hadn't yet had the courage to reach out to the other, despite the universe seemingly conspiring to do so. And yet, Minji found herself looking toward the café every time she walked past it, though she tried to ignore it as she wanted to lose herself in her work. Now it had become nearly instinctual. It wasn't about the café itself, it was the chance that he could be there. Xavian. Then it was one particularly warm evening when Minji was walking the well-traveled route once again after a long, hot day of practice. The city just felt different tonight, quieter in a sense. She could not refute the rift that had crept into the space between her and the idea of him. She was anxious, unsure what would happen if their paths really crossed again. She feared what might happen if she talked to him, if she let herself recognize the bond that had been growing in the space between them. But when she got close to the corner where the café was, she knew she had no option. Something in her felt drawn toward it, like she had to just go and see if he was there. At the café was Xavian, like every other night. This time, though, there was a restlessness in him that was more difficult to shrug off. He had promised himself that he would stop showing up, that he would release this completely conditional wish to get to know her. But the truth was that there was no escaping the strange, magnetic pull that settled itself into his chest. And so here he was, sitting by his lonesome in the corner, the stunted lights of the café flashing like a misspelled invitation. He knew he should leave. He needed to stop this thing himself. But he stayed. Minji's heart stopped when she saw him, Xavian. She froze for a few seconds, hovering just inside the doorway of the café, heart racing as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. There he sat, as he had always sat, as if he had never budged. And yet everything was different. The air between them was thick with tension, an almost unbearable tension. Their eyes met across the room for a moment. Minji didn't move. She stood frozen, her eyes fixed on his. She couldn't move. Hearts were racing as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. Her feet cemented to the pavement. And for a long moment they both did nothing. They remained utterly still, silently admitting the inescapable draw that brought them here. Each second stretched into a hammer of a minute. But then something shifted. Xavian rose up before her, his eyes not leaving hers. It was like he had made a choice. He walked slowly, mindfully as he reached the door and opened it with a gentle chime. As he stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around them, and Minji felt her breath catch in her throat. He was closer now, close enough that she could see the faint shadows under his eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Minji," he said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of something she couldn't quite place. "I need you to know something before this goes any further." Her heart pounded, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. "What is it?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering away for a moment before meeting hers again. "There are things about me, things I haven't told you. And if you knew, you might not want to be here." For a moment, Minji felt the world tilt beneath her feet. But then she straightened, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "Then tell me. Let me decide." Xavian's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of fear, or maybe regret, in their depths. "I will," he said quietly. "But not here. Not now." And as he reached for her hand, Minji felt the pull of something she couldn't name, something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. Chapter 7. The first steps everything else was mopped up. As the city hummed around them, Minji found herself standing on the sidewalk, breath stuck in her throat. Xavian's footsteps grew closer, every footfall louder than the last over the stillness of the night. It felt like the world had changed, the atmosphere buzzing with the electricity of the moment. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't even known why she'd come here tonight, but now that he was mere feet in front of her, she couldn't stop the onslaught of emotions sweeping over her. That gap between them was almost unspoken. They hadn't said a word to one another, but in that space between them, there was something deeper than silence. A pull neither could explain. Minji, Xavian said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of something she couldn't quite place. I need you to know something before this goes any further. Her heart pounded, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. What is it? He hesitated, his gaze flickering away for a moment before meeting hers again. There are things about me, things I haven't told you. And if you knew, you might not want to be here. For a moment, Minji felt the world tilt beneath her feet. But then she straightened, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. Then tell me. Let me decide. Xavian's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of fear, or maybe regret, in their depths. I will, he said quietly. But not here. Not now. And as he reached for her hand, Minji felt the pull of something she couldn't name, something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. Neither of them spoke for a moment. It was almost like they were both waiting for one of them to take a step, to ease all of the tension that was brewing over weeks of silent meetings. The air felt rich with possibility. At last, Xavian's voice pierced the stillness, a low murmur that made Minji's heart pound wildly. You're here, he said, holding his gaze at her, though a glimmer of uncertainty flickered in his eyes. I didn't think I'd see you again. Minji swallowed hard, bracing herself to hold his gaze. His presence was overwhelming, like the quiet before a storm. She felt his eyes on her, and for a second, she thought he could hear her heart hammering its way out of her, across her chest. I didn't think I'd be here, she said, her voice small in the space between them. She stepped closer into herself, a little uncertain why she had even come. But Xavian didn't move. His eyes softened. Momentarily he inched his body in, tension easing just for half a second. He raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth pulling up with subtle sincerity. You're not the only one, he said, his voice warm but flavored by something else. Something that made Minji's heart race. I've been coming here, hoping you'd walk by. The confession put her on her heels more than she realized. It was not something she was expecting him to say. There was no denying it now. You've been waiting for me? She said, the words escaping her before she could check them. He nodded, eyes never leaving hers. I guess you could say that. But I was afraid you wouldn't return. A warmth burst in her chest, an odd relief layered with confusion. This moment, this quiet exchange that seemed paused in the air, she wasn't sure what to make of it. I don't know what I'm doing, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I never even thought about why it is I walked here tonight. But now, she didn't complete her thought, not because she couldn't find the words, but because she was caught up in a feeling that she couldn't escape. In the years since, Xavian stood an inch or two closer, filling the space between them. He didn't answer at once, his expression inscrutable. Then, gently, he said, What are you afraid of? Minji looked him in the eyes, her heart pounding. She didn't know how to respond. It wasn't only fear, she had so many conflicting feelings. She was afraid of what it would mean if they got too close, of what would happen to her life if she allowed herself to succumb to this strange attraction between them. But more than that, she was terrified by how much he already meant to her, when they hadn't really even talked. I'm scared of not knowing what this is, she said at last. Her voice shook just slightly. Of not knowing if it's real, or if it's just a fleeting moment in time. Xavian smiled again, although this time with more warmth, as though he fully understood what she meant. I don't have answers either, Minji. But maybe that's the point. Perhaps we're not meant to know everything at this moment. Minji's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't known how much that meant to her. How much she needed someone to acknowledge the confusion she had been holding. I guess we'll just need to figure it out together then, she said, her voice slightly stronger now. Xavian's grin grew and his eyes softened. I'd like that. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Minji felt a flicker of something like hope inside her. It was not a promise of anything, not yet, but it was a beginning, a tentative feeling of this new unknown that they were experiencing. The air around them changed, the distance between them bridged at last. Neither had any idea what came next, but in that moment, there was something real in the quiet intimacy between them, something that could not be swept under the rug.